Hedges. There's been two cases in recent times here in America that have been widely reported of church leaders involved in sexual misconduct. One of the most well-known cases is that of the late Ravi Zacharias and his accusations of sexual abuse against him. Ravi Zacharias was a highly acclaimed Christian apologist and a speaker. The other case saw Brian Houston, global senior pastor of Hillsong, remove the New York Hillsong Church pastor Carl Lentz from his position because of an adulterous affair. Now let us recognise that misconduct goes back all the days, way back to the Bible. However, we need to acknowledge it does not have to happen. So in this Langstaff letter, I want to reproduce an article that I wrote previously entitled Hedges. This article deals with avoiding the temptations that Christian leaders face. It's based on the book I wrote called Hedges. The book is now out of print, but we are looking to reprint it soon. So let me tell you. I was fascinated years ago when I stumbled across a passage in Deuteronomy 17 in a daily devotional entitled Commands for Future Kings. I was fascinated to realize that in the early days of the nation of Israel, God gave specific directions, hedges, to place around future leaders to protect them from three major temptations that leaders face: power, sex, and money. Or as some people like to put it, the gals or the guys, the glitter and the gold. So let's look at commands for future kings. Firstly, they were commanded not to multiply horses, a symbol of power, not to multiply wives, that's sex, and not to greatly multiply silver and gold for themselves, that's money. Now note, the emphasis is on greatly multiplying wealth. It's not wrong for leaders to prosper as long as it's not at the expense of other people. Now, unfortunately, the great majority of Israel's kings ignored the commands of Deuteronomy chapter 17. The most spectacular failure to resist these temptations belongs to Solomon, who was given the ingredients for success: a strong nation, a godly father, godly given wisdom, and the ability to rule wisely. But in the end, what God told him not to do is what he did. He multiplied horses. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines, believe it or not. He began to multiply gold. Disobedience always brings consequences. It's the principle of sowing and reaping. Solomon, indeed, the nation of Israel with him, paid a heavy price for his failure to obey. The Bible says the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing. Now, Solomon's disobedience eventually resulted in a divided kingdom in Israel. Well, how can one guard against these temptations? Well, there are ways, but let me highlight three important ways of the many that are available. What I call the ABCs. A, accountability. Eugene Peterson, the author of The Message, declares, quote, "There's a saying among physicians that the doctor who is his own doctor has a fool for a doctor. If those entrusted with the care of the body cannot be trusted to look after their own bodies, far less can those entrusted with the care of souls look after their own souls, which is even more complex than bodies, and have a correspondingly greater capacity for self-deceit. All of us need other people in our lives to whom we are accountable, who can speak into our lives, who can warn us of dangers, who can honestly challenge us, people with whom we have a meaningful relationship, people who really love us enough to keep us accountable. Then we have B for boundaries. As a young minister, over 50 years ago, I learned an important lesson, namely that if I was going to be maintaining integrity in my relationships with the opposite sex, then I had to have a set of boundaries. Now, I'm not legalistic, but having seen so many leaders that fell into temptation and sexual sin, I worked out my own rules ahead of time in regard to 5 potential trouble spots. Women that you work with closely in ministry. You see, quite often a pastor does so with a person he works closely in ministry and ends up in adultery. Second, the question of secretary. I believe your wife, who is your helpmate, should have a veto power over the choice of secretary. Now, I realize in business that's not always possible. Counseling. Be careful how you counsel the opposite sex, where and when you do it. If necessary, refer them to a professional counselor. Beware that this can provide specific temptations. That's the 4th one, travel. And finally, temptress. There are still Delilahs around in the church today. A question a leader needs to ask is, what are my boundaries? Better to have a fence at the top of the cliff than an ambulance at the bottom. C stands for consecration. In Deuteronomy 17, God himself gave us one of the most important keys to avoiding these temptations. It is very simply consecration and commitment to God and his word, as expressed in Psalm 119, which declares, "How can a young man cleanse his ways? By taking heed according to your word. With my whole heart have I sought you. Oh, let me not wander from your commandments." Well-known pastor Jack Hayford described how he applied this verse to his own life as a young man. Thus, I launched upon a journey of opening my heart to him for scrutiny every day, not as an exercise in self-flagellation or berating introspection, but as an intentional means of maintaining sensitivity to his Spirit's voice, keeping integrity with his dealings in my heart. The psalmist declared, "Thy word have I hid in my heart, that I might not sin against you." This applies particularly to private personal temptations that people face, including such things as pornography. To be forewarned is to be forearmed is a saying I heard when I was a very young man, and I have never forgotten it. God warned his leaders in Deuteronomy 7, so no one coming afterwards can ever say, "I never knew." But rather, by applying these 3 simple ABCs, one can retain integrity in one's life and leadership. Now, why do some leaders stray and others stay true? There may be many reasons, but one of the reasons why such leaders fail is that they do not build a hedge of protection around their lives and their ministry. Let me give a great example in regard to ministry, as seen in the case of Billy Graham and his team. Over 60 years ago, Billy Graham and his team set down rules of ministry and life. This is what Billy Graham recorded himself about this. He said, "One afternoon, during the Modesto Crusade in California, I called the team together to discuss the problem. Then I discussed them to go to their rooms for an hour. I asked them to go to their rooms for an hour and list all the problems they could think that evangelists and evangelism encountered. When they returned, their lists were remarkably similar. And in a short amount of time, we made a series of resolutions or commitments among ourselves that would guide us in our future evangelistic work. In reality, it was more of an informed understanding among ourselves, a shared commitment to do all we could to uphold the Bible standard of absolute integrity and purity for evangelists." The first point on our combined list was money. The temptation to wring as much money as possible out of an audience, often with an emotional appeal. The second item on the list was the danger of sexual immorality. We all knew of evangelists who had fallen into immorality while separated from their families by travel. We pledged among ourselves to avoid any situation that would have even the appearance of compromise or suspicion. From that day on, I did not travel, meet, or eat alone with a woman other than my wife. We determined that Apostle Paul's mandate to a young pastor Timothy would be ours as well. Flee youthful lusts. Our third concern was the tendency of many evangelists to carry on their work apart from the local church, and even to criticize local pastors and churches openly and scathingly. We were convinced, however, that this was not only counterproductive, but also wrong from the Bible standpoint. The fourth and final issue was publicity. The tendency amongst evangelists was to exaggerate their successes or to claim higher attendance numbers than they really had. So much for the Modesto Manifesto, as Cliff Barrows called it in later years. In reality, it did not mark a radical departure for us. We had always held these principles. It did, however, settle in our hearts and minds once and for all the determination that integrity would be the hallmark of both our lives and our ministry. Billy Graham followed his own rules. For example, many years ago, Hillary Clinton wanted to talk with him, so he arranged to meet her at a restaurant with other people around him. We should note that while these boundaries apply to leaders, Christian leaders, pastors, they also apply to all of God's people. So let us live lives of integrity. That because, you see, when we live committed lives, we will bring glory to His name. So let's do it. Let's build a hedge.
Thank you for listening to the Langstaff Letter with Dr. Alan Langstaff. The Langstaff Letter is produced by Frontline Ministries, a ministry of Kairos Ministries. If you'd like to join a discussion about this edition, you can go to Dr. Langstaff's blog at kairosmin.org. We look forward to having you join us back again next week. And remember, the best is yet to be.